I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. Maya, Gavan, and Melyn, and welcome to Tolkien Untangled's list of top 10 weapons in Middle-earth. And despite those lines that I just quoted, I do, in fact, love swords and daggers and axes, and so today I'll talk about 10 of my favourite blades and arms in all of Tolkien's writings. Number 10. The Black Axe of Gothmog. So, this axe belongs to the Lord of all Balrogs, and the High Captain of the Dark Lord Morgoth's armies in the First Age. And this isn't a weapon that we know very much about in terms of its origins or its forging, but what we do know is that Gothmog's Black Axe is a straight up hero killer. Presumably, it is with this axe that Gothmog slays Feanor after the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the battle beneath the stars, and in a much later battle, Gothmog uses this axe again to slay another High King of the Noldor by cleaving open his head so that a white flame sprang up from the helm. Which means, out of all the High Kings of the Noldor who have ruled in Middle-earth after their exile, 2/5 of them were slain by Gothmog, and another was captured and imprisoned by him. And we can safely assume that Gothmog wields his black axe again in the Battle of Gondolin, where we are told that he kills the fan-favourite elven hero Ecthelion of the Fountain. Although Ecthelion also slays Gothmog, and the two of them die together in the very fountain for which Ecthelion takes his epithet. And I guess after this, Gothmog's black axe disappears from the annals of history. Presumably, it remained in the ruins of Gondolin until the drowning of Beleriand, and then it was probably lost. Although there is an interesting avenue for speculation here, because aside from Gothmog's axe, the only other Balrog weapons that are ever mentioned by Tolkien are their fiery whips, for which they are known, and the flaming sword of Durin's Bane. And we get next to nothing on this sword either, except that Tolkien writes, "From out of the shadow a red sword leaped flaming." And considering that Balrogs seem to be made up of shadow and flame, I think it's possible that the red sword of Durin's Bane may actually be an extension of his own body, as opposed to a weapon that was forged and then wielded by him. I'm not sure anyone could just pick up the red sword of Durin's Bane and then wield it as their own weapon, and so I guess the same may be true of Gothmog's black axe. Instead of being a weapon of metal, perhaps it is a weapon of shadow and flame. Perhaps Gothmog's axe is simply an extension of himself, sort of like his whip. Number 9. Aeglos, the Spear of Gil-galad. So, Aeglos is the weapon of the Noldor's last High King, and it was with this spear that Gil-galad fought alongside Elendil in their epic 2-on-1 battle against Sauron during the final battle of the War of the Last Alliance. And although both Gil-galad and Elendil were slain in this fight, we know that together they pretty much took Sauron with them. Unlike in the movie, Sauron was more or less already vanquished by the time that Isildur took up his father's broken sword and cut the ring from his finger. It was more of an execution than just a lucky swipe. And we get a few more clues about the nature of Aeglos by looking at its name. So what Aeglos means, according to the Silmarillion Index, is Snow Point, and according to the Lord of the Rings Index, Icicle. But Gil-galad's spear is not the only thing in Middle-earth with this name. Aeglos is also the name of a tall, thorny plant with sweet-smelling white flowers. And so it's a pretty cool juxtaposition that this badass elvish weapon which wounded Sauron is also named for a type of flower. And of course, because Aeglos is a weapon forged by the High Elves, we can be pretty confident that its tip would have glowed blue in the presence of orcs. No doubt this added to its icy reputation, and I think there's quite an interesting comparison to be made between the Snowpoint spear of Gil-galad and the icy blade of Gil-galad's grandfather, Finigolfin. So, in the Silmarillion we are told that during Fingolfin's duel with the Dark Lord of the First Age, he wielded a sword called Rhingil, which comes from the Quenya word Rhingae, meaning cold. And we're even told that Fingolfin's sword glittered like ice when he wielded it. But there's more to this than just the icy aesthetic of two glowing elvish weapons. Fingolfin died in his battle with Morgoth, but before succumbing, he used Rhingil to inflict crippling injuries upon the Dark Lord. And if we fast forward over 3,500 years, we find Fingolfin's grandson, Gil-galad, doing almost the exact same thing. Gil-galad also died in his battle with the Dark Lord, but he too inflicted crippling wounds upon Sauron with his icy spear Aeglos. And just like Rhingil, Aeglos is never mentioned again after its wielder is killed. Perhaps both blades remain for a while on the scorched ground of a Dark Lord's realm, glowing blue as a symbol of hope for all the free peoples who saw them. Number 8. Grond, the Hammer of the Underworld. So, speaking of Fingolfin and Morgoth, it is only fitting that I include the legendary weapon of the first Dark Lord on this list, the mighty mace of Morgoth's, Grond. Now, once again, we know absolutely nothing about where Grond came from or how it was forged, but it isn't even mentioned until the Battle of Sudden Flame, and the only time we see Morgoth wielding a weapon before this is his black spear with which he smote both trees of Valinor to their core, and alongside Ungoliant destroyed the Light of the West. So I would guess that Grond was forged sometime after Morgoth returned to Beleriand, perhaps during his first war with the native Dark Elves. Or perhaps it's way older than that, and he may have used it in the war for the sake of the elves, but then left it in Utumno when he was captured and chained up by the Valar. Either way, Grond's big moment comes at the same time in the story as Rhingil's big moment. Morgoth wields the Hammer of the Underworld in his duel with High King Fingolfin, and when he swings Grond down, it strikes the ground like a bolt of thunder. And that's not even it. Every time Morgoth misses his mark, Grond rends open a mighty pit in the earth, from which darts smoke and fire. And so, in terms of raw damage, Grond has got to be one of the most powerful weapons that Tolkien ever named. And although Grond is never mentioned again after the duel with Fingolfin, as Morgoth never goes out into battle again after that embarrassment, as I'm sure all of you know, Grond does remain a crucial part of Middle-earth's history, and during the Third Age, the servants of Sauron give this name for the Hammer of the Underworld to their great battering ram that eventually broke down the gates of Minas Tirith. And Grond is a very appropriate name for this battering ram. Tolkien tells us that this Third Age Grond was 100 feet in length and imbued with spells of ruin placed upon it by the Witch King. Its wolf-shaped head is made of black steel, and the battering ram can only be wielded by mountain trolls. So I think it's very cool that over 6,000 years after the Hammer of the Underworld was lost and Morgoth was overthrown, its legacy is still known, and it's still being felt by the enemies of the Second Dark Lord. Number 7. The Black Arrow. So this is one of those things where what Tolkien described in the books is incredibly different from what Peter Jackson gave us in the films. And in the Battle of the Five Armies movie, the Black Arrow is not only massive and designed to be fired from some kind of giant crossbow ballista type thing, but there's also appears to be quite a few of them. In the books, there is only one Black Arrow, and it's fired from a regular bow, but it is a very cool weapon in its own right. We are told that the arrow is an heirloom of the old lords of Dale, and it was passed down through the generations to the descendants of Girion, the last lord of Dale and a direct ancestor of Bard the Bowman. According to Bard, the arrow was originally created in the forges of Erebor, and given to the Lords of Dale as a gift. And it seems that the arrow has some kind of vague magical properties, because typically, obviously, arrows don't tend to last in the same way as like swords and axes do. Once an arrow is shot, it's gone. But that's not the case with the black arrow. We are told that whenever Bard loosed it, he was always able to recover it undamaged. And so, it is when Smaug brings a torrent of fire down upon Lake Town that this black arrow finally proves its worth. Bard fires a number of arrows at the dragon, but none can pierce him until Bard is left with just one arrow in his quiver, the black arrow. And when he pulls this arrow back, Bard says, "Arrow, black arrow, I have saved you to the last. You have never failed me, and always I have recovered you. I had you from my father, and he from old. If ever you came from the forges of the true king under the mountain, go now and speed well." And when Bard shoots the arrow, it pierces the bare patch in Smaug's armor, enters his underbelly, and strikes him in the heart. But there is a little bit more to Smaug's death than just the black arrow, and just like the arrow, this is a significant part of Dale's culture and history. Because Tolkien tells us that the men of Dale were able to understand the language of the local thrushes. And the thrushes of Dale are a little different from like regular real-world thrushes, as Thorin describes them as ancient, long-lived, and magical. And it was a particularly large thrush who lived on the slopes of the Lowly Mountain that heard Bilbo's conversation with Smaug, and apparently he understood everything that was being said. On the night that Smaug attacked Lake Town, this thrush came to Bard and spoke to him in some sort of bird language, and he warned Bard about Smaug's weak spot on his underbelly. And so that is how Bard knew where to aim his arrow. And although Dale is a place that we don't get a huge amount of information on in comparison to like other Mannish kingdoms such as Númenor or Gondor or even Rohan, I do find it very, very cool that the last named dragon in Middle-earth, Smaug the Golden, Smaug the Terrible, was finally slain by a descendant of the Lords of Dale, with information provided by a magical thrush of Dale and a legendary weapon of Dale.
Number 6.
The Morgul Knife. So, as I'm sure many of you guys probably know, what Morgul means is dark sorcery. And this sorcery is obviously pretty crucial in what makes the Witch King's Morgul blade so deadly. We don't know if Morgul knives are carried by all 9 Nazgul, or if only the Lord of the Nazgul gets one, but it is of course with a Morgul blade that Frodo is stabbed below Weathertop. And the poison of that blade ends up doing much longer lasting damage than the blade itself. After Frodo is stabbed, we are told that a fragment of the blade remains in his shoulder, and it slowly works its way towards his heart, sending him deeper and deeper into the Wraith world. And it's not stated whether the fragment moving towards his heart is just kind of bad luck, or some malevolent will of the blades, but there is some evidence to suggest it is the latter. Obviously, Elrond heals Frodo to an extent, and he removes the poisoned fragment, but the wound never fully heals, and Frodo feels particularly sharp pain every year on the anniversary of the day he was stabbed. Assuming this isn't just psychosomatic, I think it implies that the Morgul blade does have some sort of an evil will that affects Frodo even after the metal is removed. And this is further supported by the fact that Frodo is slightly changed after his encounter with the Morgul knife. While journeying through the darkness of Moria, we are told that his senses are sharpened and he is far more aware of things that can't be seen. Perhaps this is due to a lingering effect of the Morgul wound that shifted Frodo for a time towards the Wraith world. And interestingly, I think, Frodo isn't the only character in the Legendarium to suffer a Morgul wound. We are told that in the Third Age there was a ruling steward of Gondor called Boromir. same guy that our well-known Boromir was named after. And although we don't get much information about Steward Boromir's life, we do know that he was a great warrior who was strong in body and will and was feared even by the Witch King himself. However, during a battle with the newly unleashed race of Uruk-hai, Boromir suffered a Morgul wound, and it affected him a little differently to how it affected Frodo. Although he survived the initial stabbing, perhaps due to Athelas, we are told that the wound shortened his life and he became shrunken with pain. In the end, he died only 12 years after his father. And although Steward Boromir and Frodo are the only characters to receive a confirmed Morgul wound, we can, I think, speculate on the dark possibility that Morgul knives were also used to punish disobedient orcs. In The Return of the King, we learn from the orc Gorbag that he's terrified of the Nazgul. He says, "Those Nazgul give me the creeps, and they skin the body off you soon as look at you and leave you all cold and dark on the other side." In my mind, cold and dark on the other side sounds a lot like what a Morgul knife is known for. I guess the way these weapons actually work is that the dark magical poison that they're imbued with somehow shifts their victims from the seen world, where all incarnate beings live, into the unseen world, the Wraith world, where these victims are able to see the Nazgul for what they truly are, white-faced men in grey robes with keen and merciless eyes, haggard hands and grey hairs under silver helms, but then they become trapped in the unseen, and their presence in the seen world slowly fades into nothing. Morgul knives really are a terrifying part of Tolkien's mythology.
Number 5.
The Daggers of Westerness, aka the Barrow Blades. So these 4 daggers aren't really mentioned at all in the movie version of The Lord of the Rings, but in the books they are all incredibly important artifacts, and they are wielded by our 4 Hobbit heroes. Not long before they meet Strider, the hobbits find themselves captured by the Barrow-wights upon the Barrow Downs, and they are saved by the heroism of Frodo and the intervention of good old Tom Bombadil. And then Tom Bombadil pulls from the haunted burial mounds 4 very old daggers that had been buried there long ago. But despite their age, these daggers are completely unrusted and seemingly untouched by time. And that is because these aren't just ordinary daggers, they are daggers of Westerness, daggers of the Dunedain, and these daggers were forged with a very specific purpose. So, way back, over 1,600 years before The Lord of the Rings, what's now known as the Barrow Downs was a part of the Dunedain kingdom of Arnor, the kingdom of the north that was founded by Elendil. And the main thing that the Dunedain of Arnor are known for doing in the Third Age is battling the Witch King's invasion from Angmar. And it was during that war that these daggers were forged. The Dunedain of Arnor made these blades with now lost knowledge from Númenor, and they imbued them with sufficient powers to be able to take down the Witch King. And what I find interesting is that the Witch King recognizes these blades the first time he sees them. It seems that to a being in the Wraith world, whether that's a Nazgul or Frodo wearing the ring, these blades glow red, and the Witch King is terrified of them. Unlike in the movies, in the books, Frodo is an absolute badass at Weathertop, and the main reason he gets stabbed in the first place is because he rushes at the Witch King and attacks him with his barrow blade. Unfortunately, he only cuts the Witch King's robes, but in the hunt for the ring, we are told that if Frodo had landed a hit, the wound would have been as deadly to the Witch King as the Mordor knife to Frodo. And after Weathertop, the Witch King feared, above all, the timid and terrified bearer, who had resisted him, had dared to strike at him with an enchanted sword made by his enemies long ago for his destruction. Now, luckily for the Witch King, he is somehow able to break Frodo's barrow blade just by raising a hand when they face off against each other at the fords of Bruinen. And in Rivendell, Frodo of course upgrades his weapon to Sting. But unfortunately for the Witch King, Sam, Merry and Pippin all keep their Dunedain daggers throughout the rest of the story. Pippin uses his barrow blade to take down a troll during the final battle at the Black Gate, and Merry uses his barrow blade to kill the Witch King. Or at least sort of. Obviously at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Éowyn does the actual Witch King slaying, but the only reason that her ordinary Rohan forged sword is able to damage the Wraith is because Merry stabs him first with this ancient weapon of the Dunedain. When Merry's blade pierces the Witch King's knee, it breaks, as do all weapons that touch a Nazgul. But before that, it did what it was forged to do. After the Witch King's demise, Tolkien writes, "So passed the sword of the Barrow Downs, work of Westernesse. But glad would he have been to know its fate who wrought it slowly long ago, when the Dunedain were young, and chief among their foes was the dread realm of Angmar and its sorcerer king. No other blade, not though mightier hands had wielded it, would have dealt that foe a wound so bitter, cleaving the undead flesh, breaking the spell that knit his unseen sinews to his will. Merry's barrow blade is the reason that the Witch King falls in the Battle of Pelennor Fields."
Number 4.
Andúril, the Flame of the West. Now this is one of Tolkien's most iconic blades, no question, and there's a very good reason for that. But in order to talk about the reforged Andúril, first I need to talk a little bit about the shards of Narsil. Because relative even to the other weapons on this list, Narsil is a really old sword. It was made way back in what Tolkien calls the deeps of time, and the guy who forged it was actually a dwarf of the First Age called Telkar. Somehow, this dwarf-forged sword finds its way to Númenor in the Second Age, but we know absolutely nothing about it until it shows up in the hand of Elendil during the War of the Last Alliance. As you'll all know, Elendil wielded Narsil alongside Gil-galad wielding Aeglos in his 2-on-1 battle against Sauron. And Elendil used his sword to deal Sauron a crippling injury. But when Elendil was slain, his sword broke beneath him. And this broken sword was picked up by Isildur, who used it to cut the ring from Sauron's finger. And after this, the broken shards of Narsil were rescued by Isildur's squire, a guy called Otar, and they became an heirloom of the kings of Arinor for over 3,000 years. After the kingdom of Arinor fell into ruin, the broken sword remained an heirloom of the Dunedain Rangers, and it was held by the chieftain of the Rangers and passed from father to son all the way down to Arathorn. And when he died in battle, the blade was returned temporarily to Elrond's care along with Arathorn's 2-year-old son, Aragorn. When Aragorn turned 20, Elrond told him the truth of his heritage and he handed over the broken blade of Aragorn's ancestors. And 67 years after that, the broken blade was finally reforged. Which brings us back to Andúril. Now, obviously, in the movies, Andúril gets forged quite a bit later in the story, but in the books, this happens just before the Fellowship first set out from Rivendell. And this is a very big deal for Book Aragorn's character, because obviously the reforged Andúril is a symbol of the High Kings of Arinor and Gondor, the united Dunedain kingdoms that existed in the days of Elendil and Isildur before Arinor and Gondor ultimately split. And so, returning Andúril to the City of Kings and uniting the Dunedain is pretty much Aragorn's main motivation throughout the whole story. Unlike in the movies, we're explicitly told in the books that Aragorn didn't originally intend to follow Frodo to Mordor. He was always going to part with the others and take the westward road with Boromir at his side, taking the sword that was broken to Minas Tirith. That is the central motivation of Book Aragorn's character. But, as we all know, plans did drastically change, and after Gandalf's death, Aragorn became the leader of the Fellowship, and he became conflicted about which road he ought to take, Minas Tirith or Mordor. And although Frodo ultimately ends up making this choice for him, Merry and Pippin then pretty immediately end up getting captured, as you guys know. So, Aragorn takes a detour to go get them back. During that detour, he meets Éomer, and Éomer gives him horses, and Aragorn gives his word that he will return the horses to Edoras when Merry and Pippin are found. In Fangorn Forest, Aragorn encounters Gandalf again, instead of the hobbits, but he learns that they're safe, and so he keeps his word of returning to Edoras. Over the next 4 days, Aragorn meets Theoden, he rides with him to Helm's Deep, he fights in the Battle of the Hornburg, and he journeys to Isengard to witness Saruman's defeat. And all the while he is carrying Anduril, and using it to defend the free peoples of the West. The day after Theoden's confrontation with Saruman, Aragorn returns to his original mission of taking Anduril to Minas Tirith. But he encounters the Grey Company of Dunedain Rangers who have come south looking for him, and so he decides to reveal himself and his sword to Sauron in the Palantir, to announce to his enemy that Isildur's heir has returned, and that the blade that vanquished him the last time has been remade. And after that, Aragorn finally does make the journey to Minas Tirith, but he takes a different road to the one he intended. Instead of taking the shortest route, Aragorn crosses the White Mountains, and he travels towards the capital through the outlands of Gondor, gathering Gondorian warriors to his cause as he goes. And so, when Aragorn does finally make it to Minas Tirith with Anduril during the darkest hour of the Battle of Pelennor Fields, he turns the tide of that conflict with his union of reinforcements, which includes both Rangers of Arinor from the Grey Company and Outlanders of Gondor. In a very literal way, Aragorn unites the two kingdoms of the Dunedain in the very moment that he brings Anduril to the City of Kings. I think it's impossible to overstate the intimate relationship between Aragorn's character in The Lord of the Rings and Aragorn's weapon. Anduril is, to an extent, what Aragorn is all about. And so, as well as being just a really cool sword, Anduril is also a really cool part of the story that Tolkien built.
Number 3.
Gurthang, the Black Sword. So, relative to a blade like Anduril, Gurthang is a bit of a lesser known sword, but it is an integral part of the tale of the children of Húrin, and it's almost entirely unique among all the weapons in Middle-earth. Seriously, Gurthang is fascinating. Just like Anduril, Gurthang was not always known by that name. The sword was originally called Anglachel, and it was first forged by a very, very, very dodgy dark elf called Eöl. But Anglachel wasn't like other elven swords. We are told that Eöl forged it from metal found in a meteorite. And we're also told that it was imbued with Eöl's malice and his spite, to such an extent that the blade was seemingly sentient, but definitely not in a good way. This sword was originally given as a gift to Elu-Thingol, the High King of the Sindar, but it eventually found its way into the possession of the eldest of the children of Húrin, a guy known as Turin Turambar. And it was Turin who reforged Anglachel into Gurthang, which means Iron of Death. And although Turin is, in most cases, a really good guy, his sword really isn't. Gurthang has a wicked will, and in the end, it seems to betray its wielder. I don't want to get too into spoilers for the children of Húrin, but there comes a moment in that story where someone tries to use Gurthang to kill themselves. And in that moment we see just how sentient this black sword truly is. The suicidal character says to the sword, "Hail Gurthang, from no blood wilt thou shrink, wilt thou slay me swiftly?" And from the blade rang a cold voice in answer, "Yea, I will drink thy blood gladly, I will slay thee swiftly." And if we take this cold voice as literal, then that means Gurthang is utterly unique among all weapons in Middle-earth. It is the only one that can speak. In fact, there's only one other inanimate object in the entire Legendarium that has powers of speech, and that's the talking purse of Bill the Troll in The Hobbit. However, I would take this talking purse with a pinch of salt. The tone of The Hobbit is very different from the tone of The Lord of the Rings. It was, after all, written originally as a children's story, and so there are a few talking things in that story that may be written off as simply the embellishments of Bilbo, an unreliable narrator. However, the tale of the children of Húrin, in which Gurthang features, is probably the least child-friendly story in the entire Legendarium. This is absolutely not a kid's story. And so I do think the fact that it features a malicious, evil talking sword makes Gurthang one of the most interesting artifacts in all of Middle-earth.
Number 2.
Dramboleg. Now, this is another lesser-known weapon of the First Age, and there isn't a huge amount to say about it, but I placed it so highly on this list because what we do know about it is so cool, and because the person it belonged to is such an underrated hero. And unlike most of the other entries on this list, Dramboleg is neither a sword nor a dagger. It is a great battle axe, and it is wielded by the mannish hero Tuor, son of Huor. And fun fact, Tuor is the cousin of that Turin Turambar guy who wielded Gurthang. And there is one incredibly important battle in which Tuor fought with Dramboleg, and that is the Fall of Gondolin. However, in order to talk about the Fall of Gondolin, we first need to understand when this story was written in relation to the rest of Tolkien's writings, because although the Fall of Gondolin is one of Tolkien's most iconic tales, it was also one of the very first that he wrote, way back in 1916. It was revised in 1920, but then never updated again in the wake of The Lord of the Rings and the later Silmarillion. So there are a few things in this story that may seem a little out of place with what we know from other stories. And the most relevant of these to Tuor and Dramboleg is the nature of Balrogs. In the Fall of Gondolin, Balrogs are a lot more numerous and a lot more destructible than they afterwards became. But that said, I still think it is incredibly impressive that Tuor was able to kill not one Balrog with Dramboleg or even two, but 5 Balrogs. He is a mortal man, but he took down 5 Balrogs. Surely that must make Tuor among the absolute greatest mannish warriors in the entire Legendarium. We are told that the Balrogs were afraid of Dramboleg, and it sang like the rush of eagles' wings in the air and took death as it fell. And Balrogs aren't even the only enemies that Tuor killed with this great axe. We are explicitly told of an orc lord called Othrod, who Tuor cleaved in the head, and Tolkien even names 2 other orc chieftains that Tuor killed, Balkmeg and Lug. Tuor fought alongside the legendary elven hero Ecthelion, and he even wounded a dragon of Gondolin by hewing at a foot of the creature so that flames spouted forth. So I'm not sure if there's really any other weapon in Middle-earth that has slain such a huge variety of named evil creatures. And although it's not explicitly stated, I think we can safely speculate that Dramboleg was forged for Tuor by the elven smiths of Gondolin, which would mean that the head of this axe would also almost certainly have glowed blue in the presence of orcs. We are told that the king of Gondolin caused his most cunning artificers to fashion a suit of armour for Tuor as a great gift. But he carried an axe rather than a sword, and this in the speech of the Gondolin he named Dramboleg, for its buffet stunned and its edge clove all armour. And even though we don't see Dramboleg being wielded again after the fall of Gondolin, we know that it survived the downfall of that city, and many years later, in the Second Age, it was taken by Tuor's Mannish descendants to the island of Numenor as an heirloom of their ancestors. And there Dramboleg remained for over 3,000 years, until, just like Gondolin, Numenor was also destroyed, and the axe of Tuor was lost in the abyss.
Number 1.
Glamdring, the foe hammer. Now, Glamdring is of course best known as being the sword of Gandalf that he acquires in The Hobbit and then uses to kill both the Great Goblin and later the Balrog, Durin's Bane. But Gandalf was not Glamdring's original owner. While hanging out in Rivendell, Elrond tells Gandalf that Glamdring was made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. This Gandalf was Glamdring, foe hammer that the king of Gondolin once wore. And what makes this especially awesome is that this king of Gondolin, who Elrond is talking about, is of course the epic Silmarillion character Turgon, aka Elrond's great-grandfather. And the fact that Glamdring was forged in Gondolin is the reason why, in the books, Glamdring glows blue in the presence of orcs, just like Sting. We can suppose that Glamdring was wielded by Turgon during the fall of Gondolin, and also probably during another great battle of the First Age. And it must have been in the First Age that Glamdring acquired its reputation among the orcs. In The Hobbit, we see that orcs are terrified of this sword, but what's so interesting about that is that it's highly unlikely that any of the orcs of Goblin Town would be old enough to remember Turgon in the First Age. So, I would speculate that Glamdring is kind of like a terrifying legend among the orcs of Middle-earth. It's an ancient weapon that's familiar in their culture. I guess Turgon was such a badass back in the day that the stories of his sword have stayed with the orcs for thousands of years, and they hate it. But, of course, I can't really talk about Glamdring without also mentioning its mate, Orcrist. And although we're never told who Orcrist's original owner was before Thorin Oakenshield, we do know that they were also an elf of Gondolin. It's possible that Orcrist may even have been wielded by either Glorfindel or even Ecthelion. And so, just like Glamdring, Orcrist also glows blue when orcs are near, and considering that after Thorin died, Orcrist was laid to rest upon his tomb in Erebor, this means that the whole Lonely Mountain has a pretty useful early orc detection device at their disposal. However, there is still one huge question left to answer. How did Glamdring and Orcrist get from the ruins of Gondolin to a troll horde in Eriador? And what were they doing for the 6,500 years between Turgon's ownership and Gandalf's? Well, to be honest, Tolkien never tells us, and all we can do is speculate. But I would guess that the most straightforward timeline probably goes something like this. After the fall of Gondolin, Glamdring and Orcrist and potentially Sting were looted by the victorious orcs. But as the First Age ended and the orcs' master Morgoth was finally defeated, these swords probably found their way back into the hands of the surviving elves. Either that or the swords were transported out of Gondolin by the fleeing elven refugees. Anyway, I already mentioned that the great-grandson of Turgon was Elrond, but don't forget, Elrond had a twin brother, Elros, and he went on to become the first king of Númenor. We know that Narsil was a First Age blade that found its way to Númenor in the Second Age, and the exact same thing is true of Dramboleg, as well as a few other First Age weapons, so I don't think it's beyond the realm of likelihood that Glamdring and Orcrist and maybe Sting may have all spent the Second Age in Númenor too. When Númenor was facing its apocalypse, we know that Elendil set sail for Middle-earth, and he took with him 7 Palantiri of the First Age, as well as Narsil, and so perhaps he also rescued Glamdring and Orcrist from the downfall of Númenor. And if he did, that would put these swords in Eriador, the place we know they'll eventually end up in The Hobbit. I would speculate that perhaps these elven blades may have been heirlooms of the Dunedain of Arinor, and perhaps they were even used in the wars against the Witch King of Angmar, before being passed down through the generations as the Dunedain of Arinor became the Rangers of the North. And we know from the appendices that the Rangers of the North were very active in the part of the world where these blades are found in The Hobbit. And we also know that they had frequent run-ins with trolls. Aragorn's grandfather was actually captured and killed by trolls, and so could it be that in the waning days of the Northern Dunedain, these ancient elvish blades belonged to some rangers who were killed by trolls, and their weapons thus ended up in the troll horde of Bill, Bert, and Tom. As I say, this is just speculation, but I think it's one of the most straightforward explanations of Glamdring's backstory. Anyway, there's my top 10 favourite weapons of Middle-earth. Let me know if I missed any of your favourites, and look out for a few honourable mentions that I will include in a pinned comment below. And of course, to make sure that you don't miss any future top 10 lists or any future First Age videos, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and share this channel with your friends if you want to. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer melyn.